When we think of Vikings, we picture horned helmets, bloody raids, and epic sagas. But tucked behind these myths are the voices we rarely hear, those of the wives left behind, the ones who kept the farms, raised the children, and endured a kind of suffering that rarely made it into the history books. In this video, we're peeling back the wool curtain on the real experiences of Viking wives, the pain, the power, and the parts of their lives history forgot. Let's begin. Before a Viking girl ever learned to speak in full sentences, she learned to serve. Life in the Norse world was cold, rugged, and deeply hierarchical, and girls were taught their place early. While their brothers played with wooden swords and toy shields, Viking daughters were handed thread, kindling, and the quiet expectation to be useful. Her world wasn't the sea or the battlefield. It was the hearth, the loom, the garden, and the endless cycle of making life bearable. From age 5 or 6, girls were trained in the domestic arts, not as a hobby, as survival. She learned how to make linen from flax, spin wool into yarn, and cook stew from bones and barley. She memorized herb lore from her mother and the harsh wisdom of winter storage. Her value was in how little she complained, how well she adapted, and how much she could endure without question. Childhood wasn't gentle. It was preparation for obedience. By the time she reached her early teens, a Viking girl was expected to be fully skilled in all things domestic, but also quiet. Humility and silence were virtues. A loud girl, a rebellious girl, that was dangerous. She risked being seen as unsuitable for marriage. And in Viking society, a girl without marriage prospects wasn't just unlucky. She was a burden. Her only path to stability, safety, and food was through being wed. So, she learned to dim herself. Marriage wasn't romantic. It was practical. A transaction. Viking girls were often married off by the age of 15, sometimes younger. Fathers and uncles decided who she would marry based on alliances, land, or livestock. Love was never part of the negotiation. Consent wasn't either. She might meet her husband on the day of her wedding. She might not speak during the entire ceremony. Her life changed with a trade, and she had no say in it. Her dowry, the gifts and goods her family gave to the husband, determined her worth. It might be a handful of sheep, a small plot of land, or a chest of cloth. The more her family offered, the better her chances. She was an investment in another man's household. And the unspoken deal was simple: work, birth children, never complain. In return, she might be spared hunger. She might be spared abuse. But there were no guarantees. You might have heard Viking women had freedom. And yes, compared to other medieval cultures, some could own property or request a divorce. But the reality was grim. Only women of high status had those rights, and even then, they paid dearly for them. Most women had no legal standing, no voice in decisions, and no recourse if mistreated. The sagas that tell of bold shield maidens were the exception, not the rule. For the average wife, freedom was fiction. She was raised to be invisible, until something needed fixing. If the hearth went cold, it was her fault. If the stew was bland, her fault. If a child fell ill, her fault. Her worth was in labor that went unnoticed, and her identity was swallowed by titles: daughter, wife, mother. Never individual, never herself. And yet, this was all delivered with a smile and a fable, that she was lucky to be born Norse, that this suffering was strength. From the outside, the Viking wife looked strong, stoic, capable, and she was. But behind that resilience was exhaustion. Behind her quiet obedience was a young girl who was never allowed to dream. She didn't sail to raid foreign shores. She stayed home and bent her back to the earth. Her scars were not from war, but from spinning wheels, cold floors, and the crushing weight of expectations she never agreed to. And this was just the beginning. Once the wedding was over, the real work began. Viking wives didn't get a honeymoon or a moment to adjust. She was now property, transferred from her father's authority to her husband's. Legally, she was under his control in nearly every way. He could make decisions about her body, her labor, and her possessions. She didn't just marry a man, she joined a system that treated her as a tool for legacy building, not as a partner. The romantic image of a Viking longhouse hides what it truly was, a place of endless labor. Wives were expected to run the household, manage supplies, preserve food, sew clothing, care for the children, and serve guests, while still being emotionally available. If the husband was wealthy, there were slaves to help. But if not, she did it all herself. There was no real off time. Morning, noon, and night. Her hands were always busy, her needs always last. She had to know how to butcher a goat, thatch a roof, mix medicinal herbs, and keep a fire going in the dead of winter. And that was just her Monday. Wives in Viking society were praised for being resourceful, not because it was empowering, but because it was expected. Complaining wasn't tolerated, and if she failed, if the bread spoiled or the baby coughed too hard, she could be beaten, shamed, or blamed. Sometimes, all three. The longhouse may have looked warm from the outside, but it was rarely cozy. Smoke drifted down from the hearth, coating everything in soot. Children cried. Livestock sometimes slept indoors. The air was thick with labor, not laughter. And through it all, she worked. Day in, day out. Her husband might be away, fighting, trading, drinking, but her job never left. In fact, her tasks only multiplied the longer he was gone. She was the spine of the home. And yet, that spine was never honored. Her work was considered natural, instinctual, like breathing or blinking. No one praised her for boiling water just right so it didn't freeze overnight, or for knowing how to stretch a small bag of grain to feed a household for weeks. It was expected that she'd figure it out. She didn't earn applause. She earned survival. Her success was measured by how invisible her suffering was, how well she endured without notice. Some laws claimed to protect wives, but these were more about property than people. If a man hurt his wife severely, he might be fined, but only if she was from a well-connected family. If she wasn't, no one cared. Wives were punished for disobedience or suspicion of disloyalty. A bruised face wasn't evidence of a crime. It was a reminder to behave. Even in death, a wife's worth was often calculated by what she left behind, not who she was. Her social life was minimal. She might interact with neighbors during market days or rituals, but her world was small. Her friendships, if they existed, were whispered through chores. And if she ever confided in another woman about her pain, she risked being labeled a troublemaker. Gossip could destroy her reputation. In some cases, even lead to exile. Her safest choice was silence. The less she said, the longer she lasted. So she stitched her suffering into her apron strings. To the outside world, she seemed steady, dutiful, maybe even respected. But beneath that surface was exhaustion, fear, and loneliness. She wasn't allowed to falter. And if she did, there was no rescue, no sympathy. Viking sagas didn't sing songs for wives who kept farms alive. They sang of warriors who died with swords in hand, not of women who died in childbirth or by slow neglect. Her story wasn't forgotten. It was simply never told in the first place. In Viking society, marriage wasn't just a family event. It was an open market, a complex network of deals, debts, and silent expectations. The bride market was a brutal reality for Viking girls. Fathers treated daughters like bargaining chips. Uncles acted as negotiators. And the most important question wasn't whether a girl wanted to marry, but how many cows or silver coins her hand was worth. Her value was set by her dowry, her family's reputation, and the alliances she could forge. These negotiations could take weeks or even months, involving entire families. Men debated who stood to gain the most land or power. Meanwhile, the bride-to-be was rarely consulted. She might be told of her fate the night before the ceremony, or the morning of. Sometimes she learned it from a passing servant who'd overheard the final agreement. Her life, her future, and her body were promised to someone she had never met, someone who could be twice her age. During the betrothal process, the exchange of keys symbolized ownership. A father would hand a set of household keys to the groom, signifying that authority over the daughter, and by extension, her work and her children, had passed. To outsiders, it looked ceremonial, even romantic. But to the bride, it was a quiet loss of agency. The keys she had once played with as a child now locked her into a new life she didn't choose, with rules she didn't make. Weddings themselves were grand events for everyone except the bride. Feasts, music, and strong drink marked the occasion. Guests toasted the future, made jokes about fertility, and sang songs of conquest. The bride was expected to smile, sit still, and perform the rituals correctly. Mistakes or hesitation could insult the groom's family, jeopardizing the fragile agreement. So she focused on each careful step, placing her feet just so, pouring ale for strangers, keeping tears from staining her face. The economics of marriage went beyond the wedding day. A wife's dowry could include land, livestock, tools, or even slaves. These assets weren't gifts. They were investments meant to secure the bride's place in her new home. If the marriage ended, the dowry usually stayed with the husband's family, leaving the wife and her birth family poorer than before. This system trapped women in unhappy or abusive marriages because leaving meant losing everything and risking social ruin. Despite this harsh reality, many stories and sagas depict Viking women as fiery and free. But those legends reflect the rare exceptions: high-born women who could influence politics, or the few shield maidens who fought. For the average woman in the bride market, life was a maze with no exits. Her best hope was a kind husband, but kindness wasn't guaranteed, and a bride who hoped for it was often disappointed. Yet she learned quickly to hide her fears behind a practiced smile. So the bride market rolled on, year after year, with girls traded for alliances and land. Each new marriage ceremony repeated the cycle. Each daughter born into the system learned the same quiet lessons her mother had. And across Viking lands, this unspoken marketplace shaped families, fortunes, and futures built on the silent suffering of women who never chose to be sold. Once married, a Viking wife's life was measured by one thing above all: how many healthy sons she could produce. Motherhood was expected to begin immediately, often within the first year of marriage. Failure to conceive quickly could lead to gossip, pressure, or worse, being set aside for another woman. But for those who did become pregnant, the journey was far from the joyful storybook image. It was a brutal, dangerous path with few comforts and fewer guarantees. Prenatal care as we know it didn't exist. Midwives were rare, especially in remote villages, and many women gave birth alone or with only an older relative present. There were no sanitized tools, no reliable pain relief, and no understanding of infections. If complications arose, there were prayers and herbs, but little else. A breech birth or heavy bleeding almost always meant death for the mother, the child, or both. And if she died, life went on without pause. Mothers were expected to return to work within days of giving birth. Rest was a luxury few could afford. Livestock still needed feeding, fields still needed tending, and meals still needed cooking. A woman with a newborn strapped to her chest might spend hours chopping wood or hauling water. Her health was secondary to the survival of the farm. If she couldn't keep up, she risked scorn from her husband or his family. There was no sympathy for weakness. Infant mortality was tragically common. Up to half of all Viking babies didn't survive past age 2. Every cough, every fever, every cold night was a threat. Mothers lived with constant fear of losing a child they had carried for months, or of watching siblings waste away from sickness. But even in grief, there was no time to mourn. Chores continued, meals had to be made, and other children needed care. Tears were wiped away in silence. The pressure to produce sons was immense. Daughters were seen as useful for future marriages, but sons carried on the family name and secured inheritance. A wife who bore only daughters could face blame or ridicule, as if she chose the outcome herself. And the emotional toll was crushing. Every birth was a gamble, every miscarriage a potential scandal. The success of her womb determined her worth, and there was no space for her to question this cruel equation. Religion offered little comfort. The Norse pantheon celebrated gods of war, thunder, and death, figures that rewarded strength and conquest. Goddesses like Frigg were honored for fertility, but they offered no promise of safety. Instead, stories warned of curses, omens, and angry spirits that could steal a child or punish a family. Superstition and faith blurred together, leaving mothers desperate to protect their babies from forces they couldn't see or control, even as they blamed themselves for every tragedy. Through it all, Viking wives carried on. They rocked sick infants through sleepless nights, wove cloth with aching hands, and greeted each sunrise with the quiet hope that their children would survive another day. Motherhood was never tender or easy. It was a gauntlet of endurance, heartbreak, and relentless labor. And yet, these women found strength in the darkness, even if history never bothered to remember their names. When Viking men set sail to raid or trade, they stepped into a world of glory, gold, and legends. But back home, their wives stepped into a far quieter battlefield. With every departure, the entire burden of survival fell on the woman left behind. She didn't just wait by the door, hoping for her husband's return. She ran the farm, protected the home, raised the children, and kept the entire family from starving or freezing. Hers was a war without songs. The moment the men left, Viking wives became head of the household. This wasn't a ceremonial title. It was a relentless reality. She had to manage stores of food, organize planting and harvest, repair tools, care for livestock, and oversee any hired workers or slaves. If the farm failed, there was no safety net. Neighbors might offer pity, but they wouldn't share food. Her success or failure determined whether everyone under her roof lived to see spring. Winter was the ultimate enemy. Long, dark months of freezing winds and dwindling supplies tested every skill she had. She rationed what little dried fish and root vegetables remained. She knew exactly how many candles were left, how many nights they could keep the hearth burning. One mistake, a spoiled barrel, a frozen cow, a lost tool, could mean death for her children. The stress was constant, the stakes impossibly high, and there was no one to share the burden. Defense fell on her shoulders too. Viking lands were not peaceful meadows. Rival clans, opportunistic raiders, or desperate travelers could attack a seemingly undefended homestead. A wife had to know how to wield a knife or an axe, how to signal neighbors for help, and how to hide her children if the worst happened. She slept lightly, ears tuned for footsteps in the dark. Every creak of wood or howl of wind could mean danger creeping closer. Beyond survival, she managed debts and trade agreements. She had to remember who owed the family grain, who promised wool, and which debts her husband expected her to settle. Illiteracy was common, so these records lived in her memory. A mistake could ruin the farm's reputation or lead to conflict. In many ways, the wife was both CEO and security guard of the household. But unlike the men who raided for fame, she earned no praise for her victories. Social isolation compounded the difficulty. Other wives might visit, but only if travel was safe. Long stretches could pass without seeing another adult. Loneliness grew heavier each day. fed by fear that her husband wouldn't return at all, or that he'd come back with injuries, anger, or another woman. The quiet could be as crushing as the work. And yet, she woke each day and carried on, because she had no choice. Everyone depended on her resolve. So while Viking men built their legends far from home, Viking wives built survival from ash and snow. Their labor wasn't etched in runestones or sung by skalds, but it was what allowed the great halls to stand, the children to grow, and the stories of Viking triumphs to exist at all. They held everything together with raw, relentless determination, unseen, uncelebrated, but essential. While Viking men ventured across seas, stories of their affairs in foreign ports spread almost as quickly as their reputation for pillage. But for the wives left behind, even the suspicion of infidelity could mean ruin. Fidelity wasn't just a moral expectation. It was a rigid, dangerous standard. A Viking wife had to remain loyal, not because she was loved, but because any hint of betrayal could destroy her life, her children's prospects, and her standing in the community. Double standards ruled the culture. Viking men could take concubines abroad, father children far from home, and boast of their conquests. These actions rarely carried consequences. But if a wife was accused, even falsely, of entertaining another man, she faced severe punishment. She might be beaten, publicly shamed, divorced without compensation, or exiled. Her dowry would remain with her husband's family, leaving her penniless. Even her children could be taken from her as punishment for her supposed sin. Accusations didn't need proof. Gossip was enough. A neighbor's jealous word, a rival's rumor, or a relative's careless comment could spiral into a storm of judgment. With her husband away for months or years, a wife was defenseless against malicious talk. And once her reputation was tarnished, no amount of loyalty or good work could fully erase it. The stain of suspected infidelity lingered like a curse, passed down in whispers for generations. Religious beliefs only intensified these fears. The Norse gods valued honor, but their myths rarely celebrated women's independence. Stories warned of goddesses punished for their desires or mortal women cursed for straying. These tales reinforced the idea that a woman's virtue was directly tied to her family's luck, her husband's pride, and the health of her children. Fear of divine retribution kept many wives in line, convincing them that a single misstep could doom their entire household. Daily life offered endless opportunities for suspicion. A lingering conversation with a traveling merchant, an unexpected pregnancy after a husband's long absence, or even a playful smile in the wrong direction could spark rumors. Wives learned to watch every word, every glance. They kept their heads down, voices soft, and doors closed. The smallest mistake could cost everything. Their lives became a constant performance of faithfulness, a prison built from the eyes and opinions of others. The loneliness of these months, or years, without their husbands only sharpened the pain. Human connection was scarce, but seeking comfort was dangerous. Many wives poured their emotions into their children, animals, or gods. Some fell into quiet despair, trapped between longing and fear. Others hardened themselves into icy resilience, determined to survive the waiting game without giving neighbors any reason to gossip. Every day was a test of patience, faith, and careful self-control. In the end, the demand for absolute faithfulness wasn't about love or trust. It was about power. It ensured paternity, maintained family honor, and reinforced a system where men's actions were excused, but women's were condemned. Viking wives endured this impossible standard with stoic strength, sacrificing their own needs and desires for survival. Their stories remind us that sometimes the harshest battles are fought not on distant shores, but in the quiet corners of the home. Life inside a Viking longhouse wasn't always the cozy hearth of legend. For many wives, it was a place of fear. Domestic abuse wasn't just tolerated, it was normalized. woven into the fabric of society. Laws gave husbands the right to discipline their wives physically. A slap, a punch, or worse, wasn't seen as a crime. It was considered a man's duty to keep his household in line. And if a wife bore bruises, she was expected to hide them. Public shame for husbands who beat their wives was rare. Unless a woman's injuries disrupted work or involved a powerful family, no one intervened. Violence was a private matter. Neighbors might hear screams or see signs of abuse, but they looked the other way, fearing involvement could bring retaliation or scandal. Women who dared to speak out faced more punishment for dishonoring their husbands than the men did for causing harm. Silence was a survival strategy. Alcohol made matters worse. Mead and ale flowed freely in Viking culture, and drunken rages often ended with a wife or child bearing the brunt of anger. Heavy drinking was a point of pride among warriors, but at home it turned the longhouse into a trap. A husband's frustration from failed raids or bad harvests could boil over in a single night, leaving his family cowering. There were no safe spaces, no shelters, and no hope of protection. Religion offered little comfort. Myths about powerful gods striking down foes or punishing betrayal reinforced violent behavior as a display of strength. Tales of Loki's deceit or Thor's wrath taught that anger was divine. Even the household gods, meant to protect the home, were silent when it came to abuse. Faith became a double-edged sword, offering ritual and order, but no escape for women trapped with violent men. The gods looked away, and so did everyone else. Some sagas even romanticized violent husbands. Warriors who ruled their homes with an iron fist were admired for their strength. These stories painted them as decisive, powerful, and honorable, ignoring the terror they brought to their wives. Boys grew up hearing these tales, learning that a man's authority came through force. Girls, meanwhile, learned that resistance only made things worse, and that enduring pain with grace was the closest thing to victory they could hope for. Wives who tried to flee faced bleak prospects. A woman who left her husband risked losing her children, dowry, and any claim to her belongings. Her own family might refuse her return, fearing the social stigma or financial burden. And if caught, she could be dragged back, beaten publicly, or cast out entirely. For most Viking wives, staying, no matter how dangerous, seemed safer than running. It was a choice between certain hardship and possible death. Despite everything, many Viking wives found ways to endure. They relied on small acts of resistance, quiet moments of kindness from neighbors, or the hope that their children might grow up to live differently. But make no mistake, domestic abuse wasn't a hidden shame in Viking society. It was an accepted part of life, a darkness ignored by the very stories that glorified Viking strength. Remembering this truth brings light to the courage it took simply to survive. The physical dangers Viking wives faced were obvious, but the mental strain they endured was just as punishing. Long, dark winters turned the world into an endless night. Days blurred together with little sunlight. Isolation in the frozen landscape wore on the mind, especially for women trapped in abusive homes or burdened with keeping an entire household alive. The walls of a longhouse could feel like a prison, amplifying every worry into a suffocating storm of fear and doubt. Loneliness was a constant companion. Months could pass without seeing anyone beyond immediate family. Conversations with neighbors were brief or impossible when roads were snowed in. Even a supportive marriage couldn't erase the oppressive quiet that filled each evening. For those in unhappy homes, silence became a taunting reminder of their helplessness. The darkness outside matched the darkness inside, and the world beyond their doors seemed to vanish with every snowstorm that piled against the threshold. Spiritual fears haunted Viking wives during the long nights. Norse folklore was rich with omens, ghosts, and creatures lurking in the shadows. Women worried about trolls stealing infants, spirits punishing families for broken oaths, or ancestors sending bad luck as a sign of anger. Every strange noise outside the longhouse or unexpected death of livestock could feel like proof that unseen forces were closing in. This supernatural dread added layers of anxiety to lives already strained by survival. For many wives, depression wasn't a word they knew, but it was something they felt deeply. Despair seeped into daily life, masked as exhaustion or resignation. Sleepless nights blurred into foggy mornings. Small mistakes became overwhelming crises. A burned meal or a broken tool could spiral into tears that had no end. And because mental struggles weren't recognized or discussed, women blamed themselves, believing their sadness was a personal failure rather than a symptom of crushing hardship. Few outlets existed for relief. Religion offered ritual, but little compassion. Storytelling around the hearth provided temporary escape, but often revolved around violence or male heroics. Even gatherings or feasts could heighten feelings of inadequacy if other women seemed to handle their lives better. Vulnerability was dangerous. Sharing worries risked gossip or judgment. So Viking wives carried their fear and sorrow alone, wrapped in silence as thick as the winter snow outside their doors. The pressure to appear strong only deepened the mental toll. A wife was expected to keep smiling, keep working, and keep reassuring children who sensed the tension. Showing cracks in her resolve could invite criticism or embolden rivals. Yet suppressing every emotion came with its own cost, slowly eroding hope and self-worth. The constant balancing act between stoicism and despair left many women hollow, even as they continued to perform the tasks that kept everyone alive. Despite all this, Viking wives persevered. They found moments of peace in the glow of the hearth, comfort in lullabies sung to sleepy children, and fragile hope in the return of spring's first thaw. These quiet triumphs were rarely celebrated, but were feats of endurance as remarkable as any battle. By recognizing their mental struggles, we honor the courage it took to survive the frozen north, not just with their bodies, but with their minds intact. Though Viking wives lived under constant pressure, they weren't powerless. Many found quiet ways to resist the harsh roles forced upon them. These small rebellions rarely made it into the sagas, but they were acts of courage all the same. A wife might secretly teach her daughters skills forbidden to women, like reading runes or sharpening blades. Passing knowledge, woman to woman, kept family wisdom alive, empowering girls who might otherwise inherit only silence and fear. Food was another way women resisted. A wife might hide small reserves of dried fish or grain from her husband, ensuring she and her children could eat if he wasted resources on drink or gambling. This secret hoarding gave her a shred of control in a world where almost every decision was made for her. It meant survival when times grew lean and allowed her to protect her children without openly defying the man who held authority over them. Some women found ways to stand up to abusive husbands indirectly. Stories passed down hint at wives slipping herbs into ale to dull a violent man's rage or slow his reflexes. While these accounts are rare and often framed as legend, they show a desperate creativity. In a world that left them no safe way to escape, women turned to the knowledge of plants and poisons, wielding the only weapons they could in a battle for their lives. Secret lovers were another form of rebellion, though extremely risky. A wife might seek brief moments of tenderness with someone she trusted, often another man left behind during raids. These forbidden connections offered fleeting comfort from loneliness and fear. But discovery meant severe punishment, so such affairs were hidden with utmost care. Notes might be carved into wooden spoons or passed through whispered messages, small tokens of defiance in a world of harsh scrutiny. Helping other women escape abusive marriages or forced betrothals was perhaps the bravest act of all. Networks of wives, mothers, and wise women quietly aided those in danger, offering shelter or guidance to distant relatives. They used knowledge of hidden paths through forests and backroads to help others slip away unseen. These secret alliances showed that while Viking society valued individual male strength, female solidarity offered a quiet, powerful resistance that saved lives. Even storytelling could be subversive. Mothers told bedtime tales that subtly mocked cruel husbands or praised clever women who outwitted fate. These stories gave daughters hope and taught sons to question brutality. Laughter shared over a hidden joke or a pointed moral planted seeds of change. Each tale was a reminder that not all power came from swords or fists. Some came from words, whispered in the dark, carrying defiance through generations. Through these small but significant acts, Viking wives carved out spaces of autonomy. They didn't overthrow the system, but they bent it enough to breathe. Their resistance was quiet, but relentless, a testament to human resilience even in the bleakest conditions. These stories of cunning and courage remind us that even when women's names were forgotten, their fierce will to survive and to protect each other lived on like an unspoken legacy. When Viking wives died, their stories rarely lived on. Unlike warriors whose names were etched into runestones, most women's legacies were buried with them. Their graves tell the only hints of who they were. Archaeologists have found keys, spindle whorls, and herbs laid beside their bones, symbols of the invisible labor that kept Viking society alive. These objects whisper of lives spent working, loving, and suffering in silence, even as sagas celebrated the bloody deeds of men. Keys in a woman's grave symbolized authority over the household. They were powerful in their own way, representing the control a wife held inside the longhouse. Yet even in death, this power was confined to the home's four walls. Outside, her worth was measured by the sons she bore and the alliances she secured. Her personal dreams or achievements were rarely remembered, lost in a culture that valued conquest over quiet endurance, swords over spinning wheels. The few sagas that mention women often focus on queens or noble women whose marriages shaped kingdoms. These exceptions create a false impression that Viking society celebrated women. But for most wives, life was harsh and death unremarkable. Their names vanished from records, leaving behind only fragments of their existence. When daughters asked about grandmothers, answers were vague. She was a good wife. That was the highest praise many women ever received in life or memory. Generational trauma followed these forgotten women. Daughters inherited not just chores, but silent expectations, to endure, obey, and sacrifice without question. Husbands taught sons to rule harshly, passing down cycles of control. Without stories of resilience or resistance, the suffering repeated like a quiet curse. The absence of women's voices in history didn't just erase their past. It shaped a future where girls learned early that their stories would not be told. Today, archaeology is finally revealing the truth buried beneath centuries of legend. Analysis of bones shows signs of malnutrition, hard labor, and injuries consistent with abuse. DNA tests uncover family secrets, like half-brothers born of concubines taken abroad. Household artifacts highlight the skill and knowledge Viking wives possessed, skills that kept farms thriving while men sought glory. These discoveries give modern historians a clearer, more honest picture of Viking life. By piecing together these silent legacies, we can start to honor the women who kept the Viking world alive. They were healers, teachers, farmers, protectors, and quiet warriors in their own right. Remembering them challenges the myth of Vikings as only fearless men with axes and reminds us that strength often lives in those who endure unseen battles. Their courage deserves to stand beside the legends they made possible. Behind every Viking raid and saga stood women who carried burdens few songs dared sing. Their silent courage held families together. Their quiet resistance defied impossible odds. By remembering the hidden suffering of Viking wives, we honor not just their pain, but their perseverance. Let their untold stories remind us that true strength isn't always loud or bloody. Sometimes it's found in survival, love, and endurance that history tried to forget. Thank you for listening, and good night.